This talk is a follow-up to Chris's talk, not about how econometrics causality was taught, but how it should be taught. And it began years ago when I ran into Judea Pearl here on campus. We've had many conversations about causality, but most recently he sent me that paper by Angrist and Pischke, and that led me to send an inappropriate email to Josh Angrist about it, but I'll show you that in a minute. But my plan is to be both transparent and provocative. And I want to leave behind what I think are the two pillars, not 8, but 2. The 2 pillars of causal inference and causal training should be purpose and context. And I'll try to make that clear here in a minute. So first, with regard to context, this is a rather famous quotation by this French economist, Frédéric Bastiat, and in the midst of a long discussion about public policy, he has this quotation that between a good and a bad economist, this constitutes the whole difference. The one takes account of the visible effect, the other takes account both of the effects which are seen and also those which it is necessary to foresee. In other words, that's my statement about context. If you're going to do causal inference, you better have deep understanding of the context so that you don't just do the work on what must be seen. So let's start off with a supply and demand model that we saw in the Klein book and almost every other book in econometrics. We saw Rosa give a discussion earlier today. And it starts out with a price quantity diagram with 2 lines that intersect at a point. That point is meant to be the equilibrium at which all trades take place. So it selects the price at which the trades take place, and it determines the total number of trades. But from a mathematical point of view, it's kind of weird to think of those 2 lines, because after all, any 2 lines that go through the same point would define the same equilibrium. So how could you say one was a supply curve and one was a demand curve? It's kind of a mathematical puzzle. But then, just like we saw in the Klein book, what economists do is they imagine that there are things that will shift the supply curve, and in so doing, shift the supply curve back and forth. Whoops. That traces out the demand curve. So this isn't econometric identifiability, it's theory identifiability, in the sense that the demand curve is defined as that which is traced out by quantity price points when the supply curve is shifted from some variable. And that's the same as econometric identifiability, which is what Chris was saying. So let's just quickly go through this algebra of supply and demand. I'm going to use W to refer to weather that shifts the supply curve. It's really hard to think in any particular setting to identify the variable that shifts the supply curve and not the demand curve, and conversely. It's very difficult to do that, even though we assume that's the case. So I'm going to work with this idea that weather is a shifter, and a supply curve I'm going to write as a function of weather. And the demand curve, by the way, I don't have P as one dependent variable and Q in the other. These are just 2 linear equations that are written with Q as a dependent variable. Like in your causal diagram, you have points that go to Q and points that go to P. I just have 2 linear equations, one of which has an extra variable in there, W, which is going to be the shifter that allows me to identify the other variable. So this is sort of standard stuff. You solve for the equilibrium, and when you solve for this equilibrium, you make the finding that the coefficient on W in the reduced form is beta sub D, which is what you're trying to identify, times delta, and the coefficient in the other equation is just delta. So you're allowed to estimate that the demand curve by the ratio of 2 parameters that derive from the reduced form. And by the way, this ratio raises big issues about how you characterize the uncertainty, particularly when the denominator has very much mass around 0. But in any case, I also like to talk about expressing this in terms of derivatives, that we're going to uncover the derivative of Q with respect to P by dividing dQ dW by dP dW, and that's the identification strategy. So that's all nice and good, but the step 1 is you have to understand the context. The context is a setting in which the data are actually observed. And you don't take the theory literally. It's only a metaphor. There are no real markets. You cannot identify a single setting in which all trades take place at the same price. The real world is a price discovery process, where there are all kinds of out-of-equilibrium trades that are occurring that maybe there's some gravitational force that pulls them together called the market, but there's not a single price. And the classic case for developing this idea is you contrast the itinerant peddlers during the Middle Ages who would go from farm to farm far away from the city center and conduct a bilateral exchange with the farmer. And it's a situation of asymmetric information where the peddler knows a whole lot more about the values than the farmer. So that's one institution for creating trades. The second one is you create the market day in the market square, market day, market town, where you bring everybody together. But even in that setting, there's a lot of haggling. You kind of hear what other people are, what prices they're getting, but they're not all the same. They're definitely not all the same. In order to get to equilibrium, you have to imagine this so-called Walrasian auctioneer who goes through this tautomont process where he names the price and everybody says, well, I'll buy that much or I'll sell that much, and you keep jiggling until you get to equilibrium, and then all the trades take place. Well, that's an imagined setting and not a real one. So I think that demand and supply are not well defined, that it's a value discovery. To some extent, my feeling of value of the product will be revealed by your willingness to pay. There are inventories of goods that are maintained by market makers. You can't just take the supply and demand curves as given. There are inventories of memories that are maintained by the buyers. You've had a good trip last month, you don't need a good trip now. So it's a very much more complex setting. So to put it another way, in terms of supply and demand, as long as you match a buyer who values it more highly than the seller, you can have a transaction, out of equilibrium transaction. Here's one, and here's another one where the demander values it more highly than the seller. So you can have trades even though both prices are above the equilibrium in one case, or both prices are below the equilibrium. It's a very complex setting. Step two, so context and purpose. That's the context. The model was only a simplification. You don't take it, it's only a metaphor. You don't take it seriously. Maybe at some point you take it seriously, but not when you start to do your inferences. You recognize the complexity of the real setting. And the second thing is you've got to be explicit about the purpose. You've got to be very clear about the hypothetical intervention in which you're somehow going to change the supply and demand system. You could have a government fixing the price at some P star and willingness to buy and sell at that price, like an agricultural price support. You could have government passes like a minimum wage law in which outlaws transactions at any other price. Well, here's the question, and are these the same? Are they going to have the same impact on the price-quantity pair or the quantity of trades? And I think not. Do those two interventions have different implications about the price discovery process? Do they have different implications about the perceptions of value that the individuals who are listening into this sequence of trades are absorbing? And what about the inventories of goods and memories? Aren't those going to be different things? So you got to be very careful. And then are they viable? In other words, can you really have a government policy of that form in the long run? So here's a word that combines purpose and context into a single word, which is, instead of using instrumental variable, which sounds sort of scientific, quasi-scientific, what we should use is the word surrogate, because the word surrogate combines both the context and the intervention. The question is the weather a surrogate for a price control system? In order for it to be an appropriate surrogate, you have to worry about the context, and you're explicit about what the purpose was. So crop yields, is weather a surrogate for a price support system? I don't think so. Is it a surrogate for a law that forbids trades? I'm doubtful. So that all that econometrics built around identifiability of supply and demand, I don't really think it has a proper application, because it's free of purpose and it's free of context. This Angus and Kruger thing about quarter of birth is a surrogate or instrument for educational level, that depending upon what quarter you're going to get more education. Well, education isn't like a pill that you take, it's an experience. So an extra year of education depends on your attitude, depends on where it is. And we can get students to have more years of education if we give Pearl scholarships to randomly selected students, students selected by teachers, students selected by fellow students. You can train tiger moms so the kids go to school longer. You can have low-income housing in affluent neighborhoods. You could have an increase in the minimum wage. All those things could affect a change in the educational outcome. You think they all the same impact? You think that the rate of return to education is some kind of a structural parameter? It's got to depend upon a context, is what I would say. So let's move on to Angus and Pischke, this undergraduate econometrics instruction. And what I read in this thing is controlling your way to causal interpretations. So here's the advice on the left-hand side, and I wrote, the one thing they say is teach to the purpose, which is to talk about causal interventions. Instead of estimating equations and finding true parameters, they will have the econometrics reoriented completely toward drawing causal inferences. That appeals to me, because that's explicit about the purpose. Regression is taught, should be taught the way it's now most often used as a tool to control for confounding factors in a context in which you're trying to make a causal conclusion. Instead, the focus should be on a set of control variables needed to ensure that the regression estimated effect of the variable of interest has a causal interpretation. That is making me a little bit worried about. That's the, and then this goes even farther. Comparing regression, you add more and more controls, and then you get these insights help students understand why the latest model is more likely to have a causal interpretation than the first two. There's no reference to context. It's absolutely devoid of context. So they're still endorsing econometrics that is context-free. They're going to take the supply and demand model although it's a metaphor, take it as if it were literally true. So this is what I wrote to Josh. I said, Josh, I had the good fortune to read your latest piece from that was written with Pischke about teaching causal inference. The reason it isn't important is I've been struggling with the following problem. I have an important golf match in 2 weeks and noticed that one of the local weather forecasters has been very accurate. And I was thinking of offering her $5,000 to make a forecast of sunshine on the day of the match. Of course, I didn't know if her actually causes the weather, but I thought it was worth a gamble. What else could I do? But now that I've read your article, I can take the gamble out of the decision. Following your advice, I focused my energy on identifying all the variables that weather forecasters might have used to forecast the weather. I might include the forecasts from all the other forecasters too. And I tried all kinds of measures of atmospheric conditions, locally and far away. I tried many types of dynamic models, including error correction, different functional forms. Regardless of what I did, I could not find a way to knock her out of the equation. Thus, I concluded that her actually influences the weather, though not as much as the simple historical accuracy suggested. After controlling for everything I thought relevant, I found that a sunny forecast by her for a day in which all the other indicators are pointing to rain would lower the probability of rain from 50% to 40%, and that was highly statistically significant. And that was worth $1,000 to me, which is what I offered, and she accepted it. So then when I got home, I told this to my wife, and she was really annoyed. She said, "You're acting like a primitive human, treating anything you cannot understand as if it were causal." And so I asked Josh, did I do something wrong? So this is what Josh wrote back. Josh to Ed, "I'd like to help you, but I really don't know anything about golf." Now we got to try to get inside his head. And I think maybe he's telling me that that's a subtle way of saying the context matters. The same data set, if it wasn't weather forecasting, but it was education, and I control for all those other variables, exactly the same data, you might think I had found the causal impact of education. But a context in which you begin with this high level of doubt about whether weather forecast could really cause the weather, that context leads to a different conclusion. So I don't know if that's what his message, subtle message is, but perhaps it was. So here's my educational advice. Our classrooms need to create real intelligence, not artificial intelligence. I hope I don't insult the previous speaker, but artificial intelligence is pre-programmed responses. So I know that programs can be complex and give the appearance of learning, but they're still carrying out the programs that somebody wrote for them. Jude Pearl says no. I don't know, did they write their own code? But if they wrote their own code, they're carrying out the code anyway. My point isn't about computers. I'm talking about what goes on in classrooms is mostly lecture exam settings, and that's a way of programming responses into the students. And that's not going to do them any good in a world that we're moving into, because AI can do that memory task way better than humans can. So we've got to create real intelligence, wisdom, knowledge, creativity is what we have to emphasize in a classroom setting. And that's, secondly, we have to know economics is not a science. It's patterns and stories, good stories. It's good stories that turn correlations into causal conclusions. It's not science. And I didn't know it was that comment applied to randomized trial, but I think that's what Angus was saying there, that even that isn't scientific. And usefulness, not truthfulness, should be the goal. In maps of the LA freeway system, the freeways are red. Surface streets are black. Well, you can go and look at the colors of the roads and you can immediately reject the hypothesis that that's a good model because the roads are not red. Well, the test isn't truthfulness, the test is usefulness. And that's true of most of our models. Never intend to be true. They're meant to be useful, but the only way you can test usefulness is to try it out. Very hard to look at historical data and determine a usefulness without, in a sense, a trial. And context and purpose are the issues. A well-designed experimental randomized controlled trial renders context in the lab irrelevant. I'm probably doing a disservice to Angus. But context and purpose are still arise since transferring a laboratory finding to locations outside the lab may be problematic. With observational data, context is critical, but we teach econometrics with variables named y and x as if the context didn't matter. We don't have great ways to allow the description of the context to affect the inferences. Traditional processing allows only 0-1 hard constraints. You can either include the variable or not, or impose some kind of hard constraint. Bayesians are much better because they allow soft constraints where the things are drawn from a distribution possibly centered around 0. But it's very hard to sell a Bayesian analysis, and sensitivity analysis might make this come alive. I really do think that the data analysis of the future will involve a front end in which the circumstance, context is elicited. Before you get to the data, you've got to have some kind of conversation with a computer to indicate that you understand the context. I tried this in my class. I was teaching in this MA program in economics. I said, today I'm Alexa. And I know a lot about analyzing this minimum wage data set that I've given you to analyze, but I can only answer your questions. I can answer you all kinds of complex questions, but you, the students, have to be the ones who ask me that question. That's, I think, probably the way that teaching will be done, but also the data analysis will take that form. We have a context elicitation at the front end. And then humility is the essential characteristic of a good economist. And the Angus Pischke suggestion that a true model's silly goal is the right kind of humility, but their suggestion that if you include just the right controls, you can make a causal inference, that's the same kind of lack of humility that we shouldn't allow, and we shouldn't teach our students. It's darn difficult to persuade yourself, and even harder to persuade everybody else about some kind of causal conclusions. We need to accept that. So Merriam-Webster says the definition of an empiric is a charlatan. Did you know that? One who relies on practical experience. Or a medical definition is a member of an ancient sect of physicians who base their practice on experience alone, disregarding all theoretical and philosophical considerations. B is a quack, an empiricist. So here's my conclusion. There are two kinds of analysts who do a poor job pulling causal conclusions from observational data. There are clinicians who do not have a deep understanding of the statistical theory. For example, the medieval doctors who thought bloodletting was a good idea, because usually when they did the bloodletting, the patient improved. Sometimes they died, but they improved more often than not. They didn't understand the notion of a randomized controlled trial. But the other one is statisticians who don't have a deep understanding of the context. And I worry that that might be some of you. If you want to raise your hand at this point, fine. But the goal would be to have some of both embodied in us. Or if you're going to hire people to do a data analysis, have both of those skills represented. You need somebody who has a deep understanding of what supply and demand model is and what it isn't, and need somebody who has a deep understanding of the statistical issues in order to draw legitimate causal inferences. Any questions? Yeah, so I would totally agree with what you said, but I would add economics is fundamentally an interventionist discipline. The way we slice economics in labor economics, industrial organization, international economics, that's because there are interventions at the border. There's interventions in the labor market. There's interventions in the competitive milieu, competition among firms. And those are disciplines that study those interventions. We're a public policy discipline as opposed to most of the other social sciences, which are mostly descriptive. And if therefore we cannot translate the conceptual frameworks that we're using, which are interventionist causal frameworks, if we can't translate that into some empirical reality, it just seems like mathematical philosophy that doesn't have any particular usefulness. Yeah. Well, mechanism is another way of saying you've got to know the context.
You don't need causal interpretation. Our questions are the causal interpretation. If you're looking for average causal effect, it's defined already as a causal parameter. It doesn't need any causal interpretation. It is a causal interpretation.
I think one of the problems that I see is
Talk real loud.
sorry?
Talk real loud.
Okay, I think one of the problems that I see coming from my end is that in order to properly contextualize information, in order to see it's transportable, you need pretty good theory to run an incredible amount of data, right? And so we normally don't have that, especially people in political science. I think the theories that we have are pretty weak, don't explain a lot. And so being able to shine a really focused light on something that's really small is so much more valuable than having a really, really fuzzy light that you point at everything and can't see anything at all. I mean, I think that's why there's this emphasis that we can finally see something even if we don't know where in space that thing is.
So you say really, really good theory. I think we need to understand that theory is an approximation, and it derives its value from the fact that it isn't a full description of reality, it's simplification. So when we go to the data, the real subtle thing from my perspective of doing a data analysis is how you translate that theory, which focuses on a few forces in a special way, translate that into an empirical description of the reality. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say with regard to supply and demand. As much as we use it all the time, it's not a very good basis for planning price control or other methods of intervening, because the model is leaving too much stuff out.
I'm just saying the trade-off is governed largely by how well theories can explain the trade-off, explain like how well something can transport.
I also worry about more data in the variables, because you have the more and more confounders or other variables in the equation, the more noise in the estimate, or the more you have to make selection choices, and it becomes more and more complex. That to me is the potential problem with big data. It's a data set that is fairly short in a time sense, but very wide in terms of variables. And that creates pretty serious statistical issues, it seems to me.
Oh, wait, my last question. I was just like, I'd like to Angus' comment about so sometimes we're teaching too much based on the techniques, right? And the tricks, like anticipation and like these kind of tricks that you can see that it can impact all the effects of them. Maybe this move to the direction of researchers, instead of looking at context or at the structure of the problem, you look at the, okay, I have these tricks, where can I apply them? And that kind of leads to this to ignore the causal assumptions and focus more on discussing error terms or estimation techniques instead of the model you have in mind or the context you have in mind. Just to, so let me try to wrap this up because here quickly. So Carlos conclude that maybe both is good, because if you have, what I teach my students is if you know those tricks, then you have a framework in your mind, but when you go into your data, you might see opportunities to learn something, which is what Luke is saying, but at the same time, you don't want to be doctrinaire.